Good evening. Oh my goodness, this is Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and this is. Ooh, I've got a typo here. Hang on a second. Must make change. This is not the NycosRPG game. That was what we ran this morning at 10 o'clock. This is how professional to not have this done first. And so professional. All right. We will take a small momentary delay. Hey there, this is Jonathan Albin, and that's Game Master J. This is the Game Master's Soapbox. Today we've got a docket full of things to talk about, and about an hour or so of time. We are running an hour later than our usual schedule, only because I took a nap and didn't wake up until just now. So, fortunately for the internet, it's forgiving in that people will see this when they see it. And while there were those of you that might have hopped on at 11, I apologize for being delayed, but the announcements or posts about it did go out. So just let me get this. There we go. I'm just trying to get right and look at that. All right. So anyway, the topics for today are hooks, chains, and one-offs, playing the field of non-player characters, the collective, selective, and suggestive nature of memory, and discard. Okay, today's rant is going to be the disregard, distraction, and discipline of role-playing games. And I'll go into what that refers to here in a moment. And of course, we'll do some feedback about the first episode of the Twitch Open Experiment RPG experiment and what its future will be. And again, if there's viewers online with me, then of course I'll also do a question and answer section. So, hooks, chains, and one-offs. When we operate role-play games, there are a variety of ways to interact with the players in order to engage them. In a true open soapbox, there are no hooks, chains, and one-offs. The story simply waits for the players to choose a direction, choose the theme, and then you generate the story in the direction that they are going. The biggest challenge with a true sandbox, so to speak, is that a true sandbox can't exist. I will go into that argument at a later point, where I'll probably just do an entire change my mind episode. But hooks, chains, and one-offs are the ways that a storyteller can convey what he hopes to do in a story in such a way that the players perceive of it as their own choice. Now, I know that if my own players are watching this, they're probably going to go, aha, we have a way to prevent him. Now we can thwart the storyteller. But the key to role-play games is that the game master can take a bunch of positions, and we will go through the evolution of game master again in an upcoming episode. I've done it previously, and I would glad to talk about it. But the idea is that a storyteller, a game master, a dungeon master, whatever your property calls it, in NycosRPG, they're referred to as the directors. The director's task is to make for compelling gameplay through the various devices that he has at his hand, so that the players feel like there's something dynamic going on. That there's a through line is the shortest way to say it. And hooks, chains, and one-offs are a narrative description of them. So let me go with each one of them. Starting with the hook. This is the traditional way most game masters are already familiar with starting out adventure. It's the narrative at the very beginning of a motion picture. It's the preamble to a formal document. It's the very agency by which the anchor of the story is presented to the players in such a way that they feel compelled to head in that direction. In story writing, classic ones include, there's a princess that's been captured. There's a castle that's been overtaken. There's a village that's been raided. These classic hooks are the simplest and most sledgehammery, is that a word? The sledgehammer methodology of storytelling is to put right in the player's face, this is what's going on, you need to respond to this. And it's not, that form of hook isn't really a hook at all. That's more like a nose through the ring. It's the, pardon my eye itch. So satisfactory to actually scratch one of those. Anyway, when I refer to a hook, I'm referring to a more subtle way, and usually it's associated with the backgrounds and the interaction between players. And therefore, a storyteller who is wanting to hook the players draws their remembrance to something in particular that he wants them to focus on. Then you state the condition in a way that sounds just enough wrong that the players will want to investigate. We as human beings are pattern makers, so if we are talking about a row of dominoes and the structure of the adventure so far has felt like it's been a series of cascading dominoes, then this would be the concept that one of the dominoes in the row is just off kilter. It's going to lead someplace that is not where the throughput was going, the through line was going, and it causes concern, and players are therefore drawn to rather than compelled to pursue that hook. Now, individual hooks are fundamentally, they could be, in certain cases, directly associated with a hook or a one-off. The hooks are the playing piece, the adventuring moment, the 1 week adventure that's going to compel them, or propel them, I should say, the group to go in the direction of what the story element could be, should be, what the GM would prefer. So it sounds like manipulation when I state it overtly, but you have to realize that many times we as game masters don't state things overtly that we definitely do use, and the fun of it is to figure out how to do it in such a way that it doesn't show the signs of being manipulation or control. And man, that sometimes feels like a level of arrogance, but the issue really is that, and I've had this conversation with different game masters before, is the game master's job to tell a story, a through line story, or is the game master storyteller judge supposed to actually litigate what the players have done and manipulate the narrative so that it fits what did occur? And there would be some argument for that, because the idea is that to to the victor the spoils. The histories are written by the victors, and so on. So the very idea that we have complete and direct control of the game is a fallacy. So these hooks are, if you will, ways to correct or to redirect the adventurers in the way you want to go. Now, when we later talk about the concept of bubble tech, we can completely forego that, and we will do so. But just realize that the hooks are that individual piece that brings them onto the line. The second portion, chains, are a collection of logically progressed elements that the game master can predict that the players will pursue. In other words, if they determine that they are going to go and check out the destroyed village, then naturally you can assume that they're going to seek for tracks and try to find who did it. And that opens up the next piece, which would be the pursuit, and then the next piece would be the capture or interaction. Then there will be the conflict, and then there'll be the resolution. So that's a 5-piece chain. And the idea is that chains are an easier path once the players have been brought in with a hook. So you utilize the hook to draw them in the right direction. Then you have the chain of events that link them into one direction. Now, sometimes this is not even what you're looking for. And sessions of role-play games, I guess it's something you have to kind of gauge. So if, for example, the players were involved in a very intense storyline, next week one of the critical players in that is going to be gone for the session, or maybe multiple are, maybe it's going to be a lower volume players than usual, so the conflict will feel foreshortened or unbalanced if the players continue without the others being involved. For whatever reason, occasionally you have to do a literal one-off. And what I mean by that is you don't want a long story. You want to capture the player's attention and hold them into the direction that you're going, but you don't want to drive them too far off, but you do need to play through a session. So a one-off is a way to do that. And that is a completely, wholly isolated incident that takes up a game session from the narrative form and can be played by itself. Now, some game masters simply run serial one-offs. And while this may feel like a true sandbox, it's still generally a directed event. The players are included in the decision-making process by fundamentally driving them in one direction, but only in the terms of that one event. So the easiest examples of that would be that a group of adventurers are going along a pathway on a caravan trail and come to an oasis, and when they get there, they find that there is a localized festival. And so you can play the idea of that one-off festival, get the players involved with perhaps the religious rites or the overt party elements of the game, maybe explore different, in our world, perhaps maybe a little too much on the nose to say it, but maybe have a situation where they are introduced to a localized pharmaceutical. There are ways to do it so that the one-off is literally just that. It's going to wear off by tomorrow. Some examples of this is a city in the sand that appears out of nothing and will disappear within 24 hours, never to be seen again, at least for another 100 years or whatever. And the purpose for a one-off can be multi and varied. It can be just literally skip a week, but it's going to take care of, have fun, but we're not going to be driving the story forward or whatever. But what in any way, a hook is like a one-off, rather, is a singular step hook. A longer chain is associated with a classic adventure hook. So, all right, that's a terminology change and maybe a little bit on how to use them, but let's go on to the next part, and that is, how do we play the field of NPCs? Every storyteller, every game master finds himself at one time or another having to take on multiple personalities in a matter of moments, a difference of perhaps voices, attitudes, information basis, etc. But this collection can take up a huge amount of time if you sit and create every NPC to the same level. So, in order to play the field of non-player characters, I have found it easier to redefine what the non-player character is in terms of the story. So they break down to non-essential, then second are storyline, and the third are recurring non-player characters. And I usually drop the N off of it because the recurring and the storyline personas that you present are necessary to the story as much as even the players are, in that if they are improperly introduced, insufficiently represented and made realistic, and if they are downplayed or ignored, this leads to longer term problems. And this, of course, is associated with the way the players are perceived by the storyteller and the game players themselves. So we talked, I believe last week or maybe a week before, yesterday or the day before, we talked about the idea of the injunction that a player in a role-play game, when I'm administering the game, are actually taking on persona within a world that exists even when the players are not in that role themselves. The enjoined, therefore, have a level of existence that is higher than the others. And when you are introducing a new non-player character to the group, that NPC yet has not been formed. It's not fleshed out. It's not defined. And we don't have to go to all the development of all the details because some NPCs are overlooked. They are treated almost as objects only because the player character is busy driving forward on what the agenda is that they have. So the lowest tier of this are those objective NPCs. And that's the only ones that I actually use the term non-player character to describe. The NPCs are, actually, check something. Un momento, por favor. Okay, so anyway, the don't know what that's about. We'll talk about that later. So this lowest tier of NPC are the castaways. They're the mention and forget, find and forget. The players come into town and they're going to stop by the stables and drop off their horses. Okay, there's a stable master there. There's a stable boy who they can commission for a couple of coppers to get their horses taken care of or whatever. And the element of their existence is simply to fulfill a role, fulfill a need, and then they're gone. Granted, you could, if it was your intent as a storyteller, to flesh out that stable boy, you're going to be putting more effort into that stable boy, perhaps than the players will even deign to respond to. There are reasons to have developed them to a larger level, if and only if they are going to be the beginning of another hook, or they might be a piece of story for later. But if they do not fulfill those roles, they're just like the waitress at the restaurant. Yes, you sit down and you eat and you appreciate their service and you laugh at their jokes and all of that. They're engaging for their purpose. But once the engagement is over, nobody remembers them. Now, I use a 3-word descriptive for most of my NPCs because I'm hedging my bets that the players may actually want to engage with them, and that's more for my benefit than for theirs as players. Because if I and for clarification, when I say three-word process, I almost always give them an adjective, an adverb, and a verb that describes the person. So they are nervously confused and enigmatic. 3 words. The more dissonant the 3 are, the more likely they will be remembered by the players. But without the specifics, hang on again. Okay, so I've got a point. I'm going to take care of it in a moment. It's nothing, and then sorry for the distraction. I'm going to be talking about distractions here in a minute, and that's clearly one of them. And I broke one of my own cardinal rules, so I'll come back to that with the next section. But the non-player character who is a non-essential, any NPC, literally any or any non-essential, get it? Any NPC just simply washes off the board. You literally write his name with a dry eraser because he's going to be changed out after they leave this place, and it won't be important anyway. But I generally will put down the 3-word description and their name in my notes so that I know how to portray them if I want to draw attention to them. And if not, I'd write it as mundanely as possible, and we move on. That level of NPC, the less effort you put into it, the better off you are. The next type are the story NPCs or SPCs. I know I don't, like I said, I put the N in there because now I'm establishing something about that character. It's critically going to be important to the story, and so the players, you will want them to remember that person's name so they can recount and recollect and regain information from them if they forget or they lose information or forgot to write something down. They can still check in with that story PC within the game. So you're going to develop these somewhat. You're going to give a name, attributes if necessary, at least give the foundational value for the SPC. That foundation value gives a general idea of what their numbers are going to be for their attributes. It's a quick and dirty way to actually create a usable, functional PC for that encounter and for continuous encounters. And those usually I create a data block or a 3x5 card with the basic information on. And in particular, on the obverse, on the back of that, I'll put down the actual information that they are going to have access to, including what possible additional stuff they might be able to create if somebody is investigating and rolls a wild success. Maybe you have to give them additional information. This will give possibilities for rolls for what they might know beyond, and so et cetera, et cetera. So the SPC is a much more fleshed out in that you can interact with it on an ongoing basis. And then the final are the RPCs. And again, the idea is that these are player characters that are developed for the adventuring group to engage with on an ongoing basis. This is perhaps their innkeeper at the inn from which they are renting a room. Maybe it's the lord that they have done different jobs for. Perhaps it's a vassal who reports back to them on the outcome of secondary tasks that have been assigned and so on. But the RPCs have to be the most fleshed out. These are the ones that are going to interact with week over week. You have to show some form of adaptation and advancement. You build them a list of feature skills, so therefore they can be interacted with in particular areas and like so. Between the RPCs, NPCs, and the NEPCs, see how I did that? NEPCs, RPCs, and SPCs, you're able to define the cadre of the characters in the world in a much more clear way so that the players can now interact with them coherently, and you've already done the work that you need to do so that you don't have to continue to generate new information and try to remember what you said last week. Not that I have a problem with that ever. No. Every week I'm Johnny on the spot. I know exactly where the stories are. Yeah. All right. So now I'm going to talk. Ironically, going from that, I talk to the concepts of collective, selective, and suggestive memory. Now, it's a well-established reality that a person's memory or their ability to recollect details from a specific point in time or even a specific period of time, even with prompting, is not consistent or accurate. We create memories all the time, even adjusting the ones that we already have in our head to meet with our internal narratives. This is a major benefit to roleplay games because as a storyteller, you are perceived and revered, if you will, as being the resource of note or the resource of memory for all of the players. And so recognizing that the information that we have in our heads about past events is malleable at the least and completely replaceable at the most. The concept here is that we as game masters have to become mnemonic engineers. Yeah, fancy word, mnemonic. Look it up. No, mnemonic means of memory. Mnemonic. So mnemonic engineers. And what I mean by that is when my players sit down and I'm wanting to relate a story, I certainly have in my head what I recall being the outcome of last week's adventure, but I need to make sure the players are fully on board with that narrative so that there's no dissonance, there's no confusion or flat out ambivalence for not being completely accurate. So the first way of doing that is to do a collective memory, which is to say, as we all remember, or as you may remember, XYZ were the facts, and that has been established, and that is what we're going with. This collective memory is actually a form of cajoling. You're actually drawing from the players what they recall and amplifying where you were taking it with what they give you as information, and if necessary, adjusting or adapting to make sure that the memory, the starting point for the new adventure, for this week's adventure, is cogent and fits with their actual individual memory. Now, the irony is that more you engage your players on a week-to-week basis, the less collective memory you have to play upon, because they will have notes. They will have descriptions of what happened. They will have very clear memories of the specifics that led to that conclusion at the end of last week's session. So collective memory it's the broadest brush, but it's not necessarily the most effective mnemonic tool in the arsenal. Second is selective memory, and this is where perhaps you'd have not remembered, and a player's recommendation of what happened last week jars something within you, and you can grab a piece of that, and you still want to incorporate it with what you want to do in the adventure for the week. So you utilize selective memory to appeal to those whose memories match your own or describe the direction you want to go, and therefore it's less difficult, but it's less complex, but it's more difficult to do because you're actually grabbing particular snippets of the last week's event and drawing them with your own conclusion to bring the other players who may not have as full a collection to the same point so that the story can go forward. And then finally, suggestive memory. This is when something that's happening this week actually refers to something that occurred months ago, and you want to cast it in a certain light. So this form of a mnemonic tool is literally more along the lines of, as you probably remember, we were doing this thing in Antwerp, and then in Antwerp there was this guy. Remember, he was the guy with the dark hair. He had the funny voice. Remember, and you were actually guiding their memories. I know it sounds manipulative again, but the issue is that by pulling on the strings of what they do remember, however minimal it is, you're able to reconnect the new story with what was going on in the past, and thereby create a more collective memory going forward, not only of what happened back then, but more importantly, how it relates to what happens now. And this methodology of collective and selective and suggestive memory are your tools as a game master to take the story as you wish to tell it and couch it in the method and means by which the players also want to pursue this. Now, again, your nemesis in such direction would be particularly astute note takers, and arguably they are going to be your greatest ally in the mega scale, in the meta, in the more than just a game aspect, because your note takers are going to be your stopgaps against breaking your own established lore references. But you have to be careful with that, because the issue is that a person who is an astute note taker may also be someone who is going to attempt to gaslight or to manipulate the story you have in mind, to change it to conform with what their perspective was on previous events. So note taking is useful, but the broader elements of the storytelling is to make sure that you are carrying on a coherent story week over week over week that the players can sink their teeth into and let their minds grasp as necessary to create a collective memory of the events leading up to it. Alrighty, now we're leading to the rant. And I'm going to do as I usually do and wait for the clock to roll to the next minute before we actually start with this. And this one is a big one, and maybe this is a specifically personal rant, but I do believe that it focuses our attention on what is one of the increasing difficulties and problems with role-play games in the modern environment. Alrighty, here we go. Disregard, distraction, and discipline. The first two are a description of what I am referring to, and the last one is the solution. When you sit down at a table with a group of adventurers at the beginning of a session, and everybody's fresh-faced and excited about what's going on in the story, you have everybody's collective attention. Generally, you're able to get the establishing scene into their minds, reminding them where they are, collecting on their remembrances of last week, and build a static foundation for the adventure this week. It can be a location, it can be a condition, it can be the weather. All these things could be setting up the stage for this week's adventure. And inevitably, one, two, maybe all of your players will lose their attention with you. They'll disconnect with you for some reason, and within even just a few moments of beginning the session, you will find those players pulling out their cell phones, manipulating lists, typing messages, swiping through pictures on a dating app, whatever. They're now showing disregard. Now, what I mean by disregard is that at my table, when I'm narrating a story, when I'm engaging with the players in a story, I'm anticipating that when I'm looking at them, I'm getting from them the feedback for the story to continue. So I'm getting affirmation that they understand what's going on. I'm getting questioning looks when possible inconsistencies have been stated. I'll be getting information back about satisfaction. Players are excited about how that last piece went or whatever. All of these are the signs you would expect to see, but the turning their attention down to their phone, tipping of their head, this is the first part of this process. And this disregard leads to the larger issue. And the larger issue is that the players are not actively involved in their story because they are waiting for their turn. A player who comes from a different background in terms of playing, who hasn't had a lot of roleplay experience, will sometimes conceive of the game as you tell a bit of a story and then we roll dice, and then you tell the story and then we roll dice. And there is not a connection between the player and their persona. They're not existing in that moment. They're not drawn down to the tabletop. They're not seeing the interactions of the NPCs of having to do with them impersonally at all. And as a matter of fact, they're literally just as you would in a board game. They're waiting around for their action time, but they're also not being considerate for the others. They're disregarding the other players because they're not considering what their actions are in advance of their turn. Because even if they were not paying attention, if they were able to keep enough tabs on the story that their actions would be instantaneously described, you could actually move on. And so many times, a player who isn't actually engaged in the story still functions appropriately because they at least are paying attention to the narrative and know where we are in the scene and what particular actions are possible, and therefore they can respond quickly with what they would want to do in that situation. When I'm speaking of the disregard, I'm talking about the full-on turn their shoulder, looking down, not hearing until it's their turn to act, and then you go to them and go, okay, what are you going to do? They go, well, where are we? What's going on? And the particularly endemic egregious version of this is the one that occurs turn after turn after turn. In other words, every time you turn to player X is not paying attention. He's inattentive. He's disregarding the engagement with the other players, and he's showing disregard for the game in general, maybe even disrespect, because he's not showing any intent on being part of the story. So this really gets under my skin, and this is only part of it. The next part is the distraction, and this is the person who has a very active social calendar, and their phones are constantly going off with different notifications that they seem to have to respond to. They often, not occasional, because occasionally you understand that people have to handle things in real life during a game session, and they have to get up and leave the table or whatever. But these are the people that literally every 2 or 3 minutes they're having to say, oh, I got to step away, I'll be right back. I've got to take care of this, I'll be right back. Now, as a parent, even when I had children, I understand that these are situations that need to be engaged with. And I'm not talking about the necessary one. I'm talking about the complete disregard and disrespect of the players at the table, of somebody who feels that their personal life and their personal actions outside of the table are far more important than the ones that are at the table. And maybe I'm being a fuddy-duddy, and if I am, please respond in the comments and point out my fuddy-duddiness. Is that a word? The idea that they're disregarding the table and they're treating the other players with disrespect. And this is a frustration that I think is expanded to any time there's something going on away from the table that the storyteller can't resolve and has to simply wait for the players to come back, which causes discontinuity. It causes to have to restate the establishing moment in the game, etc., etc. So the counteraction to these is discipline. And maybe again I'm showing too much gravity for it, but the reality is that if we have established a period of time for a game session to occur, this needs to be blocked out of your schedule. For a while I had a cigar box that I would bring to the table, and in particular when I had unruly players who were continuously abusing the situation, I would require that the players' phones be put in that box so that it could be moved away from the table so that they were not distracted. Now, that sounds horrible. That sounds like a very mean thing to do, to cut people off from their social pacifier. But the reality is that if we are going to be a disciplined group, it's only for a limited amount of hours. 3-4 hours a session once a week. That's what you agreed to. That's what you're part of. So as a player, you should show respect to the game master by establishing your own rules of discipline, putting the phone in your pocket, putting it inside your bag, turning it off, turning off the notifications, whatever, because the reality is that the session does have value for the collective experience. And it is actually, I've actually won this discussion by telling players that if you put your phone in the box and the game session doesn't get any better, then we'll get rid of the box. And every time the players say, oh, that was a lot more involved, we were a lot more coherent, we were getting more accomplished, it felt more real. So the cigar box method is effective, and I would recommend it only in extreme cases. Generally speaking, having this very conversation with players is enough to shake them, to show them the relative value of your time as a storyteller, and thereby being able to resolve those conflicts in a way that makes sense to them and therefore improves the game experience for everybody. All right, but now we're going to lead into the feedback. The Twitch open experiment that I attempted on Saturday morning was numerically a complete flop. There were no players in attendance. It was me by myself in a Twitch room talking. And I have to say that it was a success and a failure. As a success, I was able to describe the narrative in an easier way. If you want to, you can check below for that video. I will mark it, attach it to this one so you can tell which one to watch next. But that actually is like a precursor now for next week's episode 2 of the Twitch experiment, which will be session 1. But the biggest note of feedback is that I've gotten no response. And I have to say that as a game master, if you set up a time to run a game, generally you have 3 or 4 minds that you have already engaged with, and you're posting that information, and therefore everybody is aware of it, and everybody shows the respect to time so that they actually show up to participate. And for the last 5 episodes of the Game Master Soapbox, I have made sure to mention the Twitch experiment and the date and time that I was going to host it. So in a way, that was my only process of expressing my schedule. So that nobody showed up is not too surprising, because after all, I'm a single person, and I mean that in all kinds of ways, but I am one guy sitting in a dark room with black background, and I'm describing what is going on within the world with the hubris that somebody cares, that there's somebody else who wants this information and will engage with me in the telling of this story. And I didn't receive that. So It's kind of like when you stand on the edge of a canyon and you shout, hoping to hear your echo, but you're not in a place where the echoes can be perceived, or that the sound wave never bounces back to you for that satisfactory response. So I've got more to do. I've got a lot more to do to get people aware of this. I've got several connections with other facilities. One of which, by the way, I'll take this moment at this point to mention. One of them is the Board Game Paradise store in Redlands, California, where I run my live games on Monday nights and Tuesday nights. And in the future, we'll be running live stream games for dedicated players on other nights of the week, which will be broadcast here on Twitch. That's coming in the near future. I've got to go do some setup for that, but it's a full service game store that covers everything from trading card games and collectible card games to tabletop miniatures games, tabletop war games, tabletop family games, and so on. Full service. They cover everything, and arguably, even if they can't find something in their shelves for you, they do allow for special orders. That's an ongoing thing with them. So, Board Games Paradise is one of my go-tos, and they are a methodology for my broadcast and promotion of the events that I'm doing. So, this is an underutilized resource for what I'm trying to do as well. Finally, there are plenty of places where I can promote this through online means, through various groups that I'm a member of and such, so that there will be additional drumbeat of awareness about the Twitch experiment going forward. And I'm going to be ceaseless in presenting the information, even if I'm right now only doing it 1 hour increments. But the idea is that I will be expanding upon the goodwill of viewers like yourself in watching these, to make sure that if you like this concept and you appreciate it, make sure you click the follow button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and click a like to help drive the algorithms for this show forward, so that we get more attention and more awareness. Because you can't develop an experiment until you've got a large enough body of evidence to determine. You have to have an established group called a control, and you've got to have a test subject base. And at this moment, my test subject base is 0, and therefore I cannot make any analysis whatsoever about the effectiveness of the experiment or the outcome of the experiment, until we can start to run those episodes. So, as a reminder, and this is going into Sunday morning, so this coming Saturday at 10 a.m. we will be running the first episode of the the NycosRPG Twitch experiment, and it will be starting at 10 in the morning and ostensibly running until 2 in the afternoon, depending on how many players and what kind of interaction we got. It may be shorter. In the case of this week's origination episode, it was about 40-45 minutes long, and provides all the information you'll need to be able to start next week. So also want to recommend that you check out NycosRPG.com, which is my website, which has information and resources such as the player persona packet that can be downloaded as a PDF, and also the NycosRPG book Dark Shards, which is the system book for the fantasy magic setups, and you can purchase that on NycosRPG.com to give yourself kind of a lead into what we're doing as far as the rules are concerned. So I want to thank you for your participation in today's episode. We are, as we have been for the last week or so, sitting with an audience of 0. So I want to thank you for your potential participation. This video will also be uploaded in the next day or so to YouTube, so take a look for it there. And you'll also find the other episodes that I've already created there as well, in a numbered fashion, so you can find the first, second, third, etc. and follow along with what we're doing. So thank you again, and it's great to talk to you. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master Jay, and this has been the Game Master Soapbox. Have a great day.